Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our program, Detroit's Birwood Wall with Gerald Van Dusen. Tonight's program, as usual, is a webinar, so your cameras and your mics are off, but you're welcome to use the chat or the Q&A features, and we'll save those questions to the end, but then I'll read them off to Gerald. Our presenter tonight is Gerald Van Dusen. Gerald is a professor of English at Wayne County Community College District in Detroit. He is an author of numerous books, including Detroit Sojourner Truth Housing Riot of 1942, and of course, the Michigan notable book, Detroit's Birwood Wall, Hatred and Healing in the West 8 Mile Community. He's also the recipient of numerous awards for innovations in teaching, learning, and technology. Thank you so much, Gerald, for joining us, and I'll turn the screen over to you.
Thanks, Phil. This is my great pleasure to visit via Zoom Macomb County, an area I do not get to very often, being from the western suburbs of Detroit. I wanted to start by telling you how I came to know about this wall, which you can see on the screen. This picture you see is one of three rather pristine pictures of the wall. It was taken by a guy by the name of John Vachon in August of 1941, a month after the wall had been constructed. It's taken from the south looking north, and it extends. You can't see 8 Mile from here, but if you could, it would be at the furthermost tip of the wall as you see it moving to the left. When I became acquainted with the wall, you couldn't necessarily see it in every backyard because of the bushes and trees and outbuildings that people had planted or put up in their yards. And there's really only one place along the stretch of the wall that you can see it for any significant length. And I'll show you a picture of that shortly. But as I say, the wall was constructed in July of 1941, and this picture was taken, one of three kind of iconic photographs of the wall, in the next month, in August, by John Vachon, who was a photographer for the US government, specifically the Farm Security Bureau, which was the organization at the time that was their agents were asked to travel the country and record resettlement. Certainly in the North, resettlement meant the movement of peoples from the South to the North for jobs, the so-called Great Migration. And so for a 10-year period from 1935 to 1944, these photographers spread out. And in the Metro Detroit area, most of the photographs were taken of factory work. I'd say from the pictures I've seen, about 90%. But John Vachon must have been told about this wall because he headed up to 8 Mile Road, a distance really from the factories, and took three really important photographs. Without these photographs, I think there's a good chance that the story could conceivably have been lost, particularly because of one photograph, which I'll show you shortly. But fast forward to 1962. So 21 years after the wall is constructed, I am a high school sophomore. I'm living on the far west side on the border of Detroit and Redford Township, 6 Mile and Telegraph area, just west of that area. Well, my parents wanted me to go to this all-boys school. They wanted me to buckle down and focus on academics so I could go to college. So they sent me to a high school at 7 Mile in Cherry Lawn. Today it's called U of D Jesuit. Back then it was just U of D High School. And one day during my sophomore year, a classmate invited me over to study for quarterfinals. I was good in Latin and he was good in math, and that worked out really well because he was having a problem with Latin and I was having a problem with geometry. So we studied a while, got some things straightened out, and we decided to walk the neighborhood. He lived in Pinehurst, just a few blocks from this wall here. And we headed from his house east in the direction of the wall, and we came upon it. And we were at the easement behind the stores along 8 Mile Road, where the wall began. And he challenged me to climb the wall and walk as far south as I could. It was kind of an initiation to anybody new in the neighborhood. It didn't seem like much of a challenge if you look at this particular picture right now, because there's no interruptions, there's no entanglements. But 20 years after it was constructed, as I think I mentioned earlier, there were quite a few trees and bushes overlapping the wall, and you had to kind of climb around stuff to make any progress. So up I go, and he jumps up behind me, and I start my trek south. And maybe 5 or 6 houses into the walk, I trip over a branch and I tumble into the soft grass below. And I just look up at him and say, this is kind of silly. I mean, why would they have constructed such a elaborate, probably expensive concrete barrier between Birwood Street and Mendota, when they could have just put up a cheap fence of some kind, if they needed a fence along the easement, wire fence. And he just looked down at me and said it was to keep people like me away from people like you. And I really hadn't thought about a relationship in those terms, he being black and me being white. And so that stayed with me, but it didn't answer the question, who constructed the wall, and why was it necessary, and when was it done, et cetera. And I would say over the course of the next few years, certainly by the time I got into college, I would make inquiries at whatever libraries I was at, university libraries, and I could find nothing whatsoever about the wall. I would find, if I looked at articles about the period of time, I would find articles about the housing riots that occurred not far from the wall, not quite walking distance, but a few miles from the wall. It's called the Sojourner Truth housing riots in 42, just a few months after the wall was put up. And then, of course, there were the strikes, the factory strikes, so-called hate strikes, where in one case at the big Packard plant, the world's largest automobile assembly plant, 25,000 white workers walked off the job because 3 blacks were promoted to the floor. Now, there were instigators, KKK instigators, no question about it. They were ferreted out and fired eventually. But the UAW and the federal government put pressure on Packard to force the workers back, threaten them with their jobs, et cetera. So anyway, the Birwood Wall, in my mind, was a precipitator of the 43 riot that occurred after the hate strikes. The riot occurred in August of 43. And so you had the Birwood Wall, you had the Sojourner Truth housing riots, and you had the hate strikes in the factories, all kind of creating this racial tension. So let me locate this wall in terms of Detroit, so you get a little bit of perspective. Now, this is a rough drawing because there is no map of this per se, so it's a little irregular. But what you see here is the outline of Detroit with certain reference points. Now, if you consider square mileage, Detroit today is 139 point something, 0.2, 0.3, whatever, square miles. And it completed its process of growth in 1926, I believe it was. And during that time, from 1800 to 1925, it absorbed more and more sections of this area until the state of Michigan made it very difficult for Detroit and other communities to just absorb, to annex more land. So it pretty much fixated at 1925. And this area up here at the top, the West 8 Mile Enclave, was one of the last areas here into the west, which completed the period of annexation. You'll notice that I've got some blocks in black signifying where Black people were allowed to obtain housing. These were racial enclaves. They could not obtain housing. They could not rent. They could not purchase outside of these areas. Why? Because of what was embedded in the terms of the deed. They were what were called racially exclusive covenants. Across the country, by one estimate, certainly in major cities like Detroit and Chicago and Buffalo and Philadelphia, 80% of all residential properties contain these racially exclusive covenants. And these covenants simply said that Blacks were excluded. Whites only could purchase this particular property. Well, Detroit was, in 1940, had a population of 1.6 million and was overcrowded, no question about it, because of the lack of available housing. And I mean, housing was being constructed, housing was being planned, but it just could not keep up with the demand coming from the South during the, as you know, so-called mass immigration, from South to North. And Detroit was not alone. Chicago was experiencing it as well. The Great Migration. The Black population of Detroit in 1940 was 150,000, give or take 1,000. The white population was approximately 1.45 in that area, million. And from 1940 until 1950, the Black population doubled. So there was enormous pressure upon, upon housing. Whites were having a difficult time, Blacks were having an even more difficult time. They were restricted still, technically until 1948, when the Supreme Court ruled that these racially restrictive covenants were unenforceable. They didn't say they were illegal or they were bad. They just said you could not enforce them. These private agreements, because that's what real estate deals were, private agreements between purchaser and purchasee. So these areas in Black were the areas that Blacks from the South were able to, or allowed to rent or purchase. And the problem was, if you're coming from the South, you're pretty much limited even beyond what you see here. Because on the west side, this area here, bounded by Grand River and Tyreman, were kind of middle class. I say kind of because there was a mix of professionals and working class individuals, factory workers, but usually second and third generation, they had established themselves. They were able to obtain financing for the construction of nice bungalows in this area. So if you're coming from the South and you had no money, you wouldn't find any place on the west side to purchase a home. You wouldn't have the funds to purchase a home on the west side here. And if you moved further north and attempted to obtain housing in an area called Conant Gardens, another area that was available to Blacks, like the west side, you're talking middle class and working class, those that could afford homes and those that had been in the Detroit area for a generation or two had been working, say, civil service jobs or had been accountants, doctors, lawyers, whatever, saved some money, purchased property, built homes, had FHA financing because it was an established community. So you were left with basically Black Bottom, mainly. Paradise Valley was the business entertainment section, but there was some housing, but basically Black Bottom. So very badly overcrowded. A little bit of housing up in North End, just kind of an extension of Paradise Valley. A lot of factories up here too, but there was some housing. And the problem was not just the overcrowding and the conditions, living conditions down here, the unhealthy living conditions. It's just that the landowner, the people that own the properties would, on a monthly basis, raise rent, $5, $10. It became extraordinarily difficult to have enough money left over at the end of the month for groceries and for other needed items. So some landowners gave Blacks an opportunity to purchase some of these decrepit structures, and many Blacks fell for it, didn't read the fine print, which indicated that if you fell behind a payment by more than 1 month, you lost your investment. So this land contract, however much money you put into it, if you were temporarily unemployed, you missed a second month payment, you lost it. You were put out in the street, and whatever you'd invested was completely lost. A few people learned about an area to the north, up the so-called West 8 Mile Enclave. And what this was, an area a half mile south of 8 Mile and a half square mile north of 8 Mile, where land was available and there were no racially exclusive covenants. So if you had a few bucks and you could purchase the land, you then began to construct your own housing. Problem was that the FHA was not going to insure mortgage loans, and so banks were not about to lend money out to people trying to build their homes. And what you wound up having to do is build a shack-like structure, and it was referred to really as shack town. And I'll show you a slide of what that looks like. So some of the people from Black Bottom, Paradise Valley, migrated north, purchased a plot of land, and subsequently began the construction of a home. You would hopefully have a neighbor who knew a little bit about concrete, foundation. Another one would know a little bit about roofing. Others would know about framing. And neighbor would help neighbor, and you'd begin the construction of your shack or shed, or in some cases, somewhat decent housing, but certainly not up to any code that would allow you to be able to sell your home in Detroit. So this is what people were leaving in Black Bottom, pack up and head north. Finally, conditions in Black Bottom were not very good. Garbage was picked up irregularly. Questions about the water, questions about the structure itself, the safety of the staircases inside and outside. Landlords would not do repairs because they knew that if you complained and you moved out, they could find somebody almost instantly because of the intense pressure for housing. For every neighbor that exited, you probably have 2 neighbors vying for that decrepit structure. So this is the kind of house that in Black Bottom that you'd be forced to live in because you couldn't afford to move into the Old West Side or Taconic Gardens until you find, and of course you hadn't heard yet about West 8 Mile. So we're going to focus now on the West 8 Mile enclave. Now, of course, I mentioned that Detroit was 139 square miles. That excludes the two cities that are within the city of Detroit, Highland Park and Hamtramck, located right here. Of course, Henry Ford's assembly line is up here, and we all know that Hamtramck was heavily Polish. There were 35 Polish churches around the city. Detroit was a mecca for Polish Catholics. And that came into play later in 42 with the Sojourner Truth housing, but that's another story. So I'm going to ask you for a moment to reorient yourself. You're looking now west at the bottom to east at the top. So we've been looking at Detroit with the north up here. So I'm going to ask you to imagine that you're driving on 8 Mile Road from the west side, heading toward Woodward from, say, Telegraph, and we're heading in the direction of Wyoming. Here's Wyoming. And to the left is Royal Oak Township, the charter township of Royal Oak. And to the right is the half square mile of Detroit that constitutes the Black Enclave, the area in which Blacks were permitted to purchase land and build their own homes. And so in 1940, with land at a premium, a developer down here, just east of the Birwood Wall, and about 12 blocks down and about 3 blocks this way, started to build some demonstration homes. It was called Blackstone number 6. And they were in the process of securing financing. And when they went to the FHA to obtain insurance on the mortgage loans, the FHA looked at the residential housing maps that had been created under FDR, and they're troubled, to say the least, that this development of homes that they want to build, and again, it's like 12 blocks away, so there's no big concern immediately, but the FHA is looking at this area here that the new developments would be abutting, and see that it's on the map, it's red. Various colors are used on the residential housing maps, red being considered the most problematic. That is not a good investment. And coincidentally, African American. So the FHA denies the bank request for FHA financing, saying that it's a hazardous area that your development is abutting. And we just cannot, for safety's sake, allow such homes to be constructed so close. There's going to be racial strife, among other things. So some enterprising banker, or maybe it was the developer himself, James McMillan, who owned the Nottingham Land Company, which developed this property here, came up with this idea. Since in many areas of the country there are these natural boundaries, rivers, mountains and hills and the like, and of course some man-made ones like railroad tracks, why not construct a barrier that would convey a sense of separation, dramatic visual sense of separation? And so they go back to the FHA, and the FHA buys the idea. Said, well, if you do construct the wall, and it is 6 feet tall, then the separation is more than symbolic, and we can work with that. And so the FHA agrees. And so houses begin to be constructed, but suddenly the war breaks out and all construction stops because war material needs to be sent overseas and needs to be sent to other parts of the city and state for war production housing, such as would become the issue on the east side of Detroit with the Sojourner Truth housing. So nothing happens. But the wall is there. The wall has been constructed in anticipation of the sale of houses to the east of the wall. And the wall extends from the easement behind the buildings on 8 Mile, a city block, until you hit Norfolk Street. And then there's an opening for cars to go by. So indeed, the wall is symbolic more than anything. And then the wall picks up again for another city block until you get to Chippewa Street. And then there's an opening for cars and pedestrian traffic to go by. And then it terminates one more city block. So it's 3 city blocks is the wall. And this is the famous Birwood Wall. The kind of fairly unique in the United States. We have such artifacts as lunch counters, water fountains in the South, symbolic of the period of segregation and Jim Crow. But there aren't many walls set up exclusively with federal participation, with federal acknowledgement, intended to segregate blacks from whites. And so these were the living conditions. This is why it was called Shacktown. Some homes were more nicely constructed than others. But the idea was over time, you would improve the housing. And by 1950, in fact, this area changes dramatically, and the FHA has agreed to finance the construction of homes in this area. What you're seeing is sandy pathways, dirt roads, and of course, on the other side of Birwood Wall, you have cement roads put in, and this becomes an afterthought. It takes until mid to late 40s before you start to see good housing, and so blacks are already significantly behind whites in terms of developing or creating equity in their homes, being able to draw from that equity and maybe financing their children's college education. Whites have been able to do that for some time, and blacks have been playing catch up for decades just on that issue alone. This is perhaps the most iconic photograph regarding the Birwood Wall. And I wish to gosh John Vachon had asked these kids their names and had recorded them. Would have been interesting to see what came of these kids, where they lived, what the quality of their life was, having been brought up in the shadow of the wall here. Little girl here with her white doll. I guess they weren't manufacturing little black dolls at that time. But that's, to me, I use that as the cover. I use that photograph as the cover of the book I wrote. And it's just, to me, it tells the whole story. Here's the third photograph that John Vachon photographed. You can see that kids are playing down at the foundation level. They're kind of digging out the basement. Parents probably told them to dig out an area where they could maybe store supplies during the winter, whatever. But since the houses were kind of scattered around the area, there were a lot of vacant lots. And to the right here, you see a garden. And these gardens were shared by neighbors. And the bounty from the neighbors were distributed. And there were quite a lot of these gardens all over the place. Whatever lot was not purchased was then used for gardens and the like. And often, I'm not sure if this house is a good example of it, but often the early structures, the early shacks, as it were put fairly close to the wall with the intention that over time they would build a nice house up front more, closer to what would be the streets. And so they would transition from the shack to the nicer house. So now this photograph was taken, one of the nicer houses. This was taken in 1941 as well by John Vachon. So some of the houses, I guess he took a picture of one of the really nice ones. And so this was a little more away from the wall. This is Alfonso Wells. This was a community activist in the 1950s and 60s. And he would get the kids to pass out handbills promoting various local candidates, either for city council or for neighborhood organizations and the like. He was very much involved in getting people involved in community efforts to upgrade and to petition the city for funding for parks and the like. And so the park located in the middle of, let me go back for 1 second here. So the wall runs from north to south, 3 city blocks. And here in the middle of the wall area is a park. It's called the Alfonso Wells Park, named after the activist I showed you a picture. I was able to obtain this photograph from the son and grandson of Alfonso Wells, who live in the area, by the way. Now, this photograph is taken from just inside the fence on Griggs Street. Griggs is, so the wall is built on the easement between Mendota, these houses are on Mendota, and Birwood. So Birwood kind of runs along here where my cursor is running. But there are no houses here with the wall because this area has been dedicated as a park for the community. You'll notice that also in this stretch of wall that you can see, if you were to visit the area, has murals that were painted on about 10 years ago, 2012, 2013. I don't have an exact date. Late summer, I think, of 2013. Right around the time Detroit was going through bankruptcy, muralists were invited to participate in a day of capturing images that they were inspired to draw. And so you'll see, for example, here, one up close one. Let me do one up close. Here's Rosa Parks boarding the famous bus where she refused to surrender her seat to a white man, which many people feel was the beginning of the civil rights movement. As you probably know, that bus that she stepped onto and refused to relinquish her seat is located at the Henry Ford. They restored it, they found it, and they restored it. And you can actually climb aboard and sit down in the seat that Rosa Parks sat on. And so that's one of the murals. There's kind of a crook in the wall at this one point, so they managed to create kind of a 3-dimensional image at this point in the wall. You can see the corner turned here, and then the wall continues north at this point to the right. Otherwise, except for this stretch of about what I would guess would be about 75 to 100 yards, like a football field, you can't really see the wall. Pretty much buried in everybody's backyards. And the backyards, as I mentioned earlier, you have all these bushes and shrubs, trees and outbuildings that just kind of cover the wall. So if you are interested in seeing the wall, then you really probably, and I'll give you directions on how to get there, although you probably have a pretty good idea from what I've already told you, but then you'll want to come and visit the park. You want to see the park rather than try to find the wall in any other place in the neighborhood. Now, I don't know if you can see this or not, the shroud. This is really an attempt to capture an image of a Ku Klux Klansman. Here's the hooded top that the Klansman would put on after he's put on the rest of his shroud there. And overlapping it, of course, there's some flip-flops and a picture of Alfonso Wells. But the wall attempts in part to depict moments in civil rights history, as well as other images of the neighborhood. Here's a picture, another one, bubbles, kids blowing bubbles, fanciful picture. Here's a picture of Theresa Moon, who's a present local activist, very alive and well, living on Grigg Street, which is the first street next to Birwood. And from her house, she can see the wall, she can see the park, and she makes sure that the park is well maintained. She doesn't hesitate to call the city, but more often than not, she does a lot of the work herself, or she gets neighbors, kids to clean up after themselves. She sees kids playing and they've got food that they're about to leave at the table. She'll skedaddle over there and she'll say, "Come on, kids, pick up your stuff. There's a receptacle over here, and let's keep this park clean." And one of the reasons she does it, not just pride of community ownership, but there are a lot of people that visit the wall. There are international visitors. And she's acts or functions as a docent. She's there to, since she's been living there since the late 1950s, she's learned quite a lot about the history, and she's ready and able to answer questions and to point out certain particulars of the wall itself, the particular drawings, what they were intended to represent, such as that, as I mentioned, the KKK, and of course, Alfonso Wells. Some people think that that picture was of maybe Martin Luther King, but it's really of Alfonso Wells. So this is the cover of the book. And as I indicated earlier, that one iconic photo I had placed on the cover because I thought it was so important. Then some images of the wall itself, just snapshots of various sectors of the wall. And then on the back side, the bus itself. And here's this other picture I showed you earlier of the wall. So what I would recommend, if this interests you at all, because I've just overviewed it, given the limitations of time, there's a really good 9-minute NBC featurette. They came to town, did NBC producers, in I think it was this past July, and I participated in its production along with Theresa Moon, and the granddaughter of a lady who was an activist back in the 40s and confronted the developer and tried to talk the developer out of building the wall, who would have, nothing to do with her and the Carver Community Group, which was the name of the neighborhood organization that these people organized. And he would have nothing to do with them because his feeling was if we don't construct the wall, we can't construct the houses. FHA made that pretty clear. So he kind of just ignored their petitions, their visits and the like. I think at one point he said, east is east and west is west, and never the twain shall whatever the phrase continues, never the phrase, never the twain shall meet. So he made it pretty clear that the wall would go up and the wall would be a permanent fixture. Common Council confronted the developer at one point and they said, well, it's really pretty much decorative. It's kind of a finishing touch to the area, refusing to acknowledge the reality that it was a segregation wall. And so in any event, if you want to see this NBC 9-minute video, and I strongly recommend it because of the graphics, they drop some really interesting graphics to explain the background to the wall. And you can go to YouTube and just type in under the search box, Birwood Wall. And although there are several very short little mini documentaries about the wall, and that's why I wrote the book, because the mini documentaries and the newspaper stories really didn't go very far in addressing the issues associated with the history of the wall. So if you go to Birwood Wall on YouTube, it should be the very first video. And you'll see that it's already had something like 270,000 views. It's been a very successful video for NBC. And they do such a fantastic job providing visuals of documents. And they had a drone. One day that I was there that they were filming, they had a drone with the intention of showing the length of the wall from on high. And that becomes part of this the video as well. It's really kind of intriguing, the grasp of the and the scope of the video. It's only 9 minutes, but it simply shows things that I cannot do in a PowerPoint. That would be a really nice supplement. So I strongly encourage you, again, go to YouTube, type in Birwood Wall, and it should be the very first video, and it'll say NBC. And Theresa Moon is featured on I Discuss the Wall, and then another lady who's the granddaughter of one of the very important early efforts to have the wall stop the construction of the wall, which did not work. As a final note, I wanted to mention that over the years, a few people here and a few people there in the area have wanted to knock the wall down, not just because it's an eyesore or because they perceived it to be an eyesore, but because of its racial history. In fact, according to one source, Alfonso Wells, after whom the park that I referred to was named, he had inquired of the city building department. After all, they had issued the permit for the construction of the wall. I even went to the building department and asked them for any records they had, and they said, nope, those were destroyed a few years after the record was created. So there were no such records, but Alfonso Wells said, I think it's time you knock this wall down. We don't need it. We don't need to be separating the neighborhoods like this. And they said, look, you want to knock the wall down, you go right ahead, but we're not going to spend city dollars to knock this wall down. It'd be a big project. It's 3 city blocks long. So Alfonso Wells just kind of threw up his hands and let it go. The fact is, in the 1950s, blacks had jumped the wall and were purchasing homes on the other side. And in 1951, 52, the first families were moving in. Whites were building, and come 1967, dramatic white flight, and the neighborhood became almost exclusively Black on the west side of the wall. And so that's the history, that's the brief history of the Birwood Wall. And Phil, if you're there,
Yeah, thank you so much. That was very interesting. And thank you so much for writing the book. It's an important thing to remember. It's an important part of our history.